Hri Om Namaha. Quote, on the other hand, that literature, which is full of descriptions of the transcendental glories of the name, fame, form, and pastimes of the unlimited Supreme Lord, is a transcendental creation meant to bring about a revolution in the impious life of a misdirected civilization. Such transcendental literatures, even though irregularly composed, are heard, sung, and accepted by purified men who are thoroughly honest. If there is a change of heart of the leaders only, certainly there will be a radical change in the atmosphere of the world, unquote. East is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. Rudyard Kipling. Revolution. Radical. Solutions to cult problems may be superficial or they may be radical. If they are superficial, they only serve the higher echelons of that cult pyramid. They may serve to make the cult cake more tasty, but they do not make it genuine. If solutions are revolutionary, they must also be radical. That was wanted in the mid-80s. Radical comes from the Latin Rittviks, which means root. As we proceed, whether or not the solution of the mid-80s was radical in relation to Prabhupada's apparent branch of the Hare Krishna movement will be discussed. If and when we choose to analyze that narrative, we should not do so without strong intelligence, without reason. As far as Vaiṣṇavism is concerned, it removes all contradictions. Therefore, it is radical. It gets to the root of everything. Removing contradictions related to false narratives is integral to its genuine process. This fact will tie into both the terms revolution and radical in the second, air quotes, ISKCON contradiction, which we shall delineate subsequently. There will be recondite realizations involved, at least to some extent. Seeing the first contradiction, it's not too difficult, but the second one is more abstruse. Nevertheless, it is certainly a contradiction. As such, it has no place in genuine Vaishnavism. It may or may not be easy to assimilate, but your host speaker will make every effort in the service of clarity in order for you to both know it and then realize it. Before that, we should consider that a narrative about anything automatically entails discussion of its matrix and its paradigm. The paradigm is built upon its matrix, just like the astral body is built on the causal body. Consciousness is more subtle and powerful than thought or the intelligence of the astral body. Intelligence, although it is related to consciousness, is still not exactly the same thing. Similarly, the matrix is the foundation of the many paradigms that function upon it, which utilize it as their base. there is the Eastern matrix. From a certain perspective, it is one, yet there are varieties to it. Then again, there is the Western matrix. It is radically different from the Eastern, as Kipling pointed out in his famous aphorism which we just read. What is one of the chief differences between the Eastern matrix and the Western matrix? It is organized religion, which is endemic to the West, and this is versus the guru and disciple being integral to the Eastern. The three Abrahamic religions, which currently predominate in the West, as we all know, are loaded with organized religions. His Divine Grace, Śrīla Prabhupāda, came with the Eastern matrix. He thus came here as a genuine theistic revolutionary, and this was affirmed in the first quote. Although he tried to disguise that to some extent, he really did not, at least not completely. Did Prabhupada bring Vedic culture here to the West? Not really. His matrix was not a Vedic matrix. It was instead a para-Vedic matrix. Para means transcendental. His movement was completely transcendental to the Vedas. It represented the cream of the Vedic teachings. In the Eastern matrix, we find the atheistic matrix upon which Buddhism and has its paradigms, yes, in plural. There is the Shinto paradigm, built upon an Eastern matrix. We could go on. But the Eastern matrix is only one, generically, and that was the one Kipling wrote about. We are obliged to recognize it as it is vastly different from the Western matrix. To reiterate, Prabhupada bestowed upon us the revolutionary Eastern matrix of the Para-Vedic, and the specific line of this matrix was the Brahma, Mattva, Gaudiya, Vaiṣṇava Sampradaya, which we also call the Guru Parampara. He built his ISKCON paradigm upon that matrix. Now, any Eastern paradigm has a cult pyramid, but unless it degrades and is intentionally changed, that alone does not constitute organized religion. Prabhupada did not bring us an organized religion paradigm. His particular paradigm was the sole Acharya model. The spiritual science of theistic transcendentalism has its intricacies. Joe Schmo and Rosie the Riveter are not eligible to understand them. They can only be understood via Guru Parampara, which means via a self-realized, or better than that, God-realized guru, or in some cases, a disciple of such a guru who is actually following him and not changing his message or the absolute philosophy in any way. The material world is the perverted reflection of the spiritual world, but the warping principle gets worse. Everything that is of transcendental value also has its perverted reflection, including an Eastern matrix which is of the warped variety. The atheistic Buddhist matrix is one such example, and it has already been mentioned. What Prabhupada brought us, the Para-Vedic matrix, is the real Eastern matrix. All Vaishnavas, irrespective of their lines, are linked to the Para-Vedic matrix, which, as just mentioned, also must have a perverted reflection. And that perverted reflection can be called the pseudo-Para-Vedic matrix, the pseudo-Para-Vedic matrix. Now, if this is all too much for you, why did you take up search for the absolute truth in the first place? If you are a genuine seeker for realization in the spiritual science of theistic transcendentalism, You must want to understand these things. What is the paradigm that is built upon the pseudo-para-Vedic matrix? Well, that's an easy answer. It is Sahajiyism. Those 11 great pretenders from the late 70s were all Sahajiyas. They were all imitators of the Mahabhagavat, but the sole Acharya paradigm is not what they established, and we shall tie this in subsequently. Instead, they created a new one, the multi-Acharya paradigm, since they all had the temerity and audacity to declare themselves successors to Prabhupada. And that had intrinsic contradictions. Quote, actually, a guru cannot be bad, for if someone is bad, he cannot be a guru. You cannot say bad guru. That is a contradiction. What you have to do is simply try to understand what a genuine guru is, unquote. Quote, an intelligent person can understand Maya's tricks and see the contradictions in all her allurements, unquote. Quote, how can I be responsible for you if you don't obey? How can you be responsible for me? Sartre claims that you are responsible for others, but if others do not follow your instructions, how can you be considered responsible? This is all contradictory. Unless there is some standard, there must be contradiction, unquote. There are actual contradictions, and then there are apparent contradictions. Apparent contradictions appear to be so due to a poor fund of knowledge. They can and should be easily cleared up when we are sincere and serious, but they can be tricky. The principle of apparent contradictions can be misused. Those cults and their leaders and the fanatics who follow them misuse apparent contradictions. Bogus cults are especially prone to do this when it comes to the opposed narratives that they push in relation to the Hare Krishna movement and in relation to Prabhupada's branch of it, especially related to the aftermath of his disappearance. Of course, even previous to his disappearance, there is an accurate narrative versus many inaccurate ones. One of the better ways that we can distinguish between the accurate and the inaccurate narratives is by spotting the contradictions in the latter. Now, there will also be a handful of apparent contradictions in the genuine interpretation of the Krishna movement's narrative. Our presentation will not shy away from explaining them for your edification and realization. Spiritual science must have knowledge within it, and that entails some logic and reason. After all, the Vedanta Sutra is all about logic in understanding the absolute truth of the all-good Supreme Personality. It is called Nyaya Shastra for a reason. Regarding that great work, it engages, in some of its sutras, in exposing and overcoming contradictions. For those of you who have read the commentary of Baladev Vidyabhushana on Vedanta Sutra, you know this fact beyond a doubt. Indeed, constantly throughout the work, a wrong interpretation is first given by an amorphous entity called the Purva Paksha. Then the contradiction in his statement is exposed either immediately or soon thereafter. Purva means first. First impressions can be misleading, at least indirectly by calling him or it the Purva Paksha. A first impression is implicit to what he speaks. Often the Purva Paksha even sounds logical, but it isn't. It is mistaken knowledge the conditioned souls are prone to be victimized by, and the siddhanta given afterwards dispels it. This format and principle of Vedanta Sutra is utilized in this our presentation. We expose the contradictions implicit in the narratives pushed by so-called ISKCON. The real narrative will be presented in this presentation, which will have to tackle a handful of apparent contradictions. Wrong narratives, loaded with mistaken knowledge, are integral to Maya's agency to destroy the Krishna consciousness movement. In combination with the personality of Kali, Mayaka narratives have been effective so far in killing Prabhupada's branch of Chaitanya's tree of life. Indeed, false narratives contain a deep allurement of their own. This is because they are conducive to expanding actions that grease the skids for enjoyable, illusory entanglements. The insincere followers of the bogus cults are not at all serious in their so-called spiritual sojourn. As such, these angry people are allured by false narratives that the deviant leader of so-called ISKCON props up for them, and then they become disgusted. There must be a standard in order to discern what is accurate and what is inaccurate in relation to Prabhupada's Hare Krishna movement, and that standard must be free of contradictions. Quote, furthermore, there are many persons who cannot understand spiritual existence at all. Being embarrassed by so many theories and by contradictions and various types of philosophical speculation, they become disgusted or angry, and foolishly they conclude that there is no supreme cause and that everything is ultimately void, unquote. They want to be cheated, and they are cheated. Simple for the simpletons. In order to understand the real narrative of what went down and why, you cannot remain a simpleton. Spiritual science has its complexities, and this becomes all the more applicable since the stage of economy was removed for the Western population at large decades ago. You could be very simple and still make tangible spiritual progress in the late 60s and early 70s when the ISKCON institution was functioning in the way it was supposed to work. Such has not been the case, however, for a very long time. When you do overcome the appearances, these show bottles lose all meaning to you because, as a theistic transcendentalist absorbed in spiritual science, you get nothing from them. If you enter and buy into any of their wheelhouses, you are negatively impacted in your progress in spiritual life. It gets bollocksed. You get glazed over. Your pragya goes silent. Mundane intelligence begins to augment your mind's allurement to the bogus cult, and you terminate further spiritual realization completely. In this presentation, we are going to analyze the bogus narrative of so-called ISKCON. With notable exceptions here and there, it demonstrates outward displays which can appear to the uneducated and foolish eye to be manifestations of devotional fervor. They are anything but. Quote, one will gradually become sahajya, or one who takes spiritual advancement as something materially manifest, unquote. Now, how can you pin any of this on Prabhupada? You cannot. How can you claim that he's responsible for all of those deviations? That is contradictory at every level, even at the level of common sense. Common sense also informs us that lies and contradictions are not the same thing. So-called ISKCON is loaded with lies in its narrative. It's supposed to be run by Brahmins who are supposed to be honest. However, if you call that a contradiction, from one perspective it is, that's too general in order for us to really spot the deeper flaws in the air quotes ISKCON narrative. A contradiction is a tell, T-E-L. When you spot that contradiction, you can then dig into the situation that informs in order to discover the lies it is pushing. Let us now proceed to find those tells in the air quotes ISKCON narrative. But first, we must discuss the value of doing so as well as its applicability. You will find no document produced by that deviant cult which specifies its narrative. If you approach one of its stalwarts and question him about his institution's narrative, even if he allows you to do this, you will only receive some quick statement, often a one-liner, in which he boxes everything into a single corral. None of those leaders want to discuss the topic in general or answer those questions, those kinds of questions. As such, to some degree, herein, we are presenting their narrative for them, because all of its pieces of the puzzle that they created fit, but only when they're delivered to you free from wrong historical factors or mistaken knowledge. Again, we are not emphasizing their lies in this presentation. We've done that before, as you well know. We're not even emphasizing their big lies. One such being is Prabhupada allegedly appointing 11 successors to himself in July of 1977. We are instead pointing out two important contradictions, which then allows you to conclude that the air quotes ISKCON narrative is inaccurate, or if you prefer, that it is a false narrative of what really went down. The first contradiction is related to the appointment of 11 Rittviks in July of 1977. If that was a recognition by Prabhupada that these were his most advanced disciples, that they were Madhyams and had been for some time, then why appoint them merely as Rittviks? The common banter is the etiquette argument. The disciple is not supposed to initiate his own disciples in the presence of his spiritual master. In other words, if his spiritual master is still materially manifest. That is Vedic etiquette. But that is not a mandate if the Diksha Guru decides to override it. Prabhupada was fully willing to override it, and he proved that in letters to two of his leading men in 1969. In relation to the point being made here, the excerpts proving his willingness to discard that etiquette, we shall simply reproduce one of those excerpts from his letters. Quote, "Maybe by 1975, all of my disciples will be allowed to initiate and increase the numbers of the generations. That is my program," unquote. Since that was his program, that also must have been his desire and plan. He wanted regular gurus. If he could have seen that any of his disciples had attained that level, he would not have appointed Ritviks. If those 11 men were gurus in waiting, meaning that they were qualified to initiate but would only act as Ritviks until Prabhupada left the scene, that contradicts what Prabhupada clearly stated was his program. He was still here in 1975. It is a contradiction to claim that they were all already qualified gurus but held back by the general etiquette. Prabhupada did not care about the Vedic etiquette as far back as 1969. We just proved that in connection to the excerpt and in connection to his disciples initiating new people and connecting them to the Guru Parampara, connecting them because they were qualified Diksha gurus. And now we have this room conversation from April 22nd, 1977. Prabhupada, you become authorized. I am waiting for that. You become all Acharya. I retire completely, but the training must be complete. Leading secretary. The process of purification must be there. Prabhupada, oh yes, must be there. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wants that. Amara Agyaya Guru Hanya. You become guru, but be qualified. Little thing, strictly follower, leading secretary, not rubber stamp. Prabhupada, then you'll not be effective. You can cheat, but it will not be effective. This conversation with TKG was only a few days more than a month earlier than that all-important meeting in the room conversation at Raman Reti. When Prabhupada on April 22nd, 1977 says, quote, little thing, strictly follower, unquote, he's not referring to an Uttama Adhikari. The Mahabhagavat is a successor to the Guru. And that is not a little thing. On the contrary, it is a very, very big thing. Prabhupada was obviously referring to the Madhyam Adhikari, especially since the Madhyam is just that, strictly following. The Madhyam is qualified to be a regular guru, but none of Prabhupada's disciples were qualified in April of 1977. And all of a sudden, they were a month later. All of a sudden, they were when Prabhupada appointed 11 Rittviks in July of 1977. Tattvamasi. Those Rittviks weren't gurus at any level. They weren't madhyams. They could only be appointed as Rittviks, which means that they could conduct the initiation fire sacrifice on behalf of Prabhupada, the actual guru. They were all Rittviks doing that at different times before, and the Rittvik process was rejuvenated again in July of 1977. If they were gurus, Prabhupada would not have appointed them as Rittviks. It is a major contradiction, a major tell. The historical revisionism of the so-called ISKCON narrative, promoting the mistaken knowledge that the 11 were already gurus by mid-1977, is thus made very dubious. Prabhupada's actual program was to have regular gurus initiating their own disciples while he was still physically present. We all know what followed after Prabhupada left the scene. Then there was basically a 4-month interim wherein the only major change was Kirtanananda jumping the gun at Moundsville and taking Uttama worship from every one of his inmates there, including godbrothers and godsisters. A handful of GBCs huddled in Atlanta about that, but decided it best to confront everything at Mayapur in the spring. What came out of that was, of course, the first transformation, the zonal Acharya debacle. Were there contradictions in it? Sure. However, they could all be rationalized to some degree as they were less blatant. After all, when the GBC swallowed all that Swami B.R. Sridhar baited them with, they had a powerful fallback position to allegedly legitimize all that they were doing, including the creation of those guru zones which he suggested. The schism between so-called ISKCON and Gaudiya Mat, represented by Swami B.R. Sridhar, had a major irony in it, obviously. However, was it also a contradiction? Not really. Even if you think it may have been so, it was not a blatant one. After all, air quotes ISKCON leaders finally realized that he misled them in so many ways and was hurting their movement, so they had every right to split from him and jettison Jayatirtha. Compromise and contradiction informed so-called ISKCON since the late 70s until now. For those devotees who are not part of it, who see it, and who preach against it, non-contradiction and confrontation inform each and every one of them, including their groups. So we have now delineated and exposed the first major contradiction. The next important contradiction to spot and understand is what turned out to be intrinsic to the second transformation. The Zonlacharya debacle was the first transformation. The second transformation had its seed begin to sprout in late 1984, but that was not until the following 3 years that it grew, developed momentum, and then overcame the Zonlacharya scam, replacing it. The history of the second transformation is fairly well documented, but the major contradiction intrinsic to it is little understood. You will understand it now, however. We find this entry from Doktorsky's second book, entitled 11 Naked Emperors, in relation to Ravindra Swarup, known also as William Deadwyler III, claiming that he was leading a revolution against the pretender Mahabhagavats. Quote from the book. Ravindra Swarup considered his election to the GBC as punishment. Punishment he deserved because his campaign to eliminate the Zonlacharya system. Ravindra recalled, "I had wanted to return to my services of writing and scholarship with the Bhaktivedanta Institute and the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, but I fell unwittingly under the sway of a fairly well-established law. If you lead a successful revolution, you are condemned to become part of the government." There is no doubt that in the activities of reform I had to criticize many devotees who, deviations and shortcomings notwithstanding, harbored an inviolable seed of devotion to Prabhupada and Krishna. Having to serve on the GBC was only a fitting punishment for my offense, unquote. Keep his statement about himself in mind, because it is integral to the second contradiction that is going to be elucidated here. What was said to be going down and what actually went down in relation to the collegiate compromise, the second transformation. When someone uses the term revolution, what is being conveyed? There are some common meanings connected to it, and then there's some incidental ones. One common theme is liberation. Another common theme is a revolution back to an original position. Another one is that a revolution removes the elites of the system it replaces. A revolutionary in the spiritual context, as far as a devotee of Prabhupada is concerned, is not someone who's merely advocating reform. That is a milquetoast disqualification, and a real cult revolution is much, much deeper than that. It is a contradiction if a self-declared revolutionary, when alleging that he is leading a revolution, winds up doing something very different and quite advantageous to him, by the way, from what revolution actually stands for, especially in the context of a spiritual movement. A revolution was promised by Ravindra in the mid-80s. Did it pan out? Or was it heavily, read totally, compromised by turning out to be nothing more than a changing of the deck chairs on the Titanic? Because what he ushered in, previously waving the banner of revolution in his position papers, was nothing more than a veneer of a reformation, not a revolution. It replaced one concoction, the zonal one, with another concoction, an oligarchical regency, and that's all it did. Contradiction means rascal. The stage of uprooting the zonal acharyas, a stage strongly desired by most of Prabhupada's disciples after experiencing what the zonals wrought for over 8 years, demanded something much greater than what the second transformation brought in. Much greater. The second transformation, its change, compromised with the zonals. It compromised with the zonals who fully cooperated with it. So-called ISKCON could only survive during the mid-80s as long as its internal contradictions were not recognized. But we're recognizing them here. The new cult, the second transformation, would be tested soon afterwards. But that was after all the presidents of the centers climbed aboard the reform and accepted the new boss and the new GBC, which was really not very new at all. That was after the so-called chief revolutionary, Professor Blueblood, was voted on to the allegedly improved GBC and also voted in as a Diksha Guru, an institutional guru recognized by that very governing body. He came in with a fervor which quickly petered out, but he was the big winner when the Bolsheviks conquered the Mensheviks. The cult presidents were part of the momentum which overcame, in about 2 years' time, outrageous glorification of those zonal acharyas. The original 11 were not accepted anymore by the mid-80s, and a handful of new gurus had been added during the early 80s also. And those guys who were added, all of them also took Uttamadhikari worship. However, the temple presidents were forming an alliance by 1984 and 85, especially in North America, but take Moundsville out of that equation. And that alliance was called NATPA, N-A-T-P-A, the North American Temple Presidents Association. Professor Blueblood was the temple president at Philadelphia, and he was leading the charge on behalf of NATPA. He wanted the high-flying gurus to be busted down, and he was supposed to be the vanguard to make sure it took place. What was being advertised by this insurrection as its casus belli? What was being advertised was a revolution. Ravindra called himself a revolutionary. Herein lies the essence of the contradiction. Prabhupada was against all contradictions. And there are many statements and purports by him validating this fact. We've already produced some of those. Prabhupada was also just as adamantly opposed to compromise. Here are but a few examples of that, proving it. Quote, "My Guru Maharaj never compromised in his preaching, nor will I, nor should any of my students," unquote. Quote, "Many times I have been told by other so-called holy men that I should not expect that foreigners will be able to avoid these sinful activities. But I never compromised in any way. And as a result of our sticking strictly to our principles, our position is unique," unquote. Quote, Siddhanta Sarasvati was so learned, so he should be like that as far as possible. No compromise. He never compromised. Some godbrothers complained that his preaching was chopping technique and it would not be successful, but we've seen that they all fell down, unquote. If the second transformation was actually a revolution, then there would not be any contradiction to what it advertised and what its results were. It would also not have made so many compromises in carrying out its mission. In such a process, it had been bona fide, in such a process of rectification of the movement, which means removing all the vestiges of the previous transformation, it would have attacked the roots of the bogus gurus and their improperly initiated disciples. This would have been mandatory action for any revolutionary. The movement had a bona fide guru-disciple process previous to its going off the rails in the spring of 1978. Something akin to that process would have to have been reinstated movement-wide in the mid-80s. That would have to have involved removing all of the gurus which were implicated in the bogus process. It would have to have included delegitimizing all of the bogus initiations. There could be no compromise in this if it was actually a revolution led by an actually revolutionary leader, which it wasn't. The first transformation of the Zonal Acharya debacle had to be thoroughly uprooted, was it? Instead, was covert fear of creating a new schism impelling the contradictions and compromises that the second transformation wound up implementing? That's a rhetorical question, obviously. If that second transformation, if it had been bona fide, then why should there have been any fear of a short-term backlash? A short-term backlash would have to be expected because material nature is so constituted. It would have to have been directly confronted and endured, but it wasn't. Instead, what did the second transformation actually enact? It actuated a major compromise based upon mistaken knowledge of the science of the theistic ladder of spiritual advancement in the process of bhakti yoga. It allegedly busted down the high-flying gurus, using a few of them as scapegoats via excommunication. It allegedly busted the rest down from Uttama Adhikaris to Madhyama Adhikaris. Allegedly. They were to be known as regular gurus now, rather than Mahabhagavats to be worshipped by all. However, they were never Uttamas. They were all great pretenders. They were all Sahajiyas. You do not bust down a Sahajiya to the level of Madhyama Adhikari, a regular guru. That does not represent the ladder of bhakti yoga. A genuine Madhyama Adhikari is light years more spiritually advanced than any Sahajiya, especially those pretenders who had been hippies less than a couple of decades previously. Their disciples were all improperly initiated. Each and every one of those newcomers had to be confronted about that fact. The only ones who were confronted were the disciples of gurus who got either de jure or de facto excommunicated. Those new people were urged to accept reinitiation from a list of institutionally approved gurus, which included former zonals and those who also took Uttama worship a bit later, along with a slew of new men who were bought off by being voted into the post of initiating spiritual master during the Mayapur GBC Asat Sabha of 1986. The whole arrangement was a massive institutional concoction. It could not be fobbed off as a mere adjustment, because the roots of the problem, which required a radical solution, were not uprooted whatsoever. The whole arrangement was a massive compromise. Yeah, what about the so-called revolutionary Professor Bluebud? What was his status after all was said and done? Oh, he cleaned up big time. He got voted in as a new guru before that herd of his other godbrothers, those who cooperated with the Bolsheviks and adopted its compromises, later achieved the post in 1986. However, it got even better for him, as he also secured the vote to become a GBC. He then held title to the trifecta, initiating guru, GBC, and temple president. Now, did all of these rascals shift over to the Western matrix when this went down? After all, instead of implementing a bona fide guru-disciple paradigm, the second transformation brought in a collegiate compromise that reeked of a regency as its operating principle. Eventually, it would degrade into a queue process for any of its members in order to attain guru status. That became known as the governing body's no objection certificate, which is very indicative of an organized religion. However, to answer the question, so-called ISKCON did not shift into building its mid-80s replacement paradigm atop a Western matrix. It still built it upon just what the first transformation used, the pseudo-Paravedic matrix. It facilitated its third transformation to the Hindu hodgepodge when it was on the verge of collapse due to contradictions and compromises coming home to roost. But that's another story. We have talked about that in previous audios and videos. In summation, we have explained and exposed two major contradictions by the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. The second one can be summarized as the chasm between what the second transformation promised and what it institutionally actually implemented once it overcame the embarrassed and rejected remnants of the first transformation. The second transformation brought in unauthorized reforms, not anything which was even slightly revolutionary. It was led by a man steeped in the university mentality, who then utilized his position papers in order to gain power. It was led by a man who compromised with the handful of zonals, those who were willing to cooperate with him when they all got exposed. Along with temple presidents loyal to him, he beat back the Mensheviks, who rightly asserted that there could be no correction of the cult's ills without delegitimizing all the gurus preceding that insurrection. But that was far too radical for Professor Bluebud. And it also got in the way of his ambitions. He wanted to get to the top of the ISKCON turtle tank, and he did just that. Has this second major contradiction now been made clear to you? It has a very bad astral smell, but understanding it for what it is helps overcome the stench of its major deviations and compromises. Quote, "So contradiction means childish. Contradiction is not scientist. Contradiction is childish," unquote. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. Prabhupada named 11 Rittviks to conduct ceremonies during his last year with us. He did not name a successor. and he did not officially name any regular gurus. Such recognition in historically tangible form never took place. 11 Ritviks went on to claim that they were Diksha gurus, appointed by Prabhupada after he left physical manifestation. That's when they made the claim. Simultaneously, they divided the world into zones as their pseudo-devotional playgrounds. They then took Uttama Adhikari worship from the improperly initiated disciples they made in their zones, and then they claimed to be successors in Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement. In the mid-80s, there was a backlash against all of this forming, mostly by the North American temple presidents. This insurrection was advertised as being a revolution, but it was no such thing. If Prabhupada had recognized any one of his disciples as being a qualified Diksha guru, he would have empowered that personality as a regular guru, even in his physical presence. As he said in early 1969, that was his program. He did not do so because none of his disciples were qualified. The leaders of the second transformation had a fiduciary and devotional responsibility to uproot the debacle that went down after Prabhupada left the scene. They failed to do so. They were all implicated as aiding and abetting the deviation by cooperating with those great pretenders. The so-called revolutionaries wanted to be worshipped as gurus themselves, so they were prone to compromise. And that is exactly what they did in the mid-80s. They compromised. They were and are all ridiculous little children when it comes to spiritual life. As far as the demigods are concerned, those personalities who did all of this to the movement, those little children, they're all insignificant pretenders in the eyes of the demigods. In rationalizing the whole affair, the contradictions they thus created are childish. Overcome any influence they may have had on you. They deserve no genuine status in Prabhupada's movement because they are not spiritually advanced. The two contradictions they created in their first two transformations are baked into the tasty but warped ISKCON cult cake. Those contradictions expose its transformations, but only for those devotees who want to see things as they are. Sadeva Samya.